Hypercarry, Dot, Remembrance, Super Break, and Elation. Of 5 archetypes, 3 must pay a price. Honkai Star Rail has a gigantic problem where every single archetype comes pre-packaged with their best-in-slot teams, and it's suffocating team-building creativity, and I can definitely understand that players feel horrible when they're forced to pull units they don't like just to get their favorite's best team. Parasitic design has encroached upon a lot of Honkai Star Rail's recent releases, and this last year has been a tipping point that I can no longer ignore. For the definition of this problem, I'll pan this over to this Distraction Makers clip.
One of the concepts we talked about in that video was the idea of parasitic design, which parasitic design is a term that Mark Rosewater coined that basically just talks about mechanics that just want to hang out with themselves. But that's not how parasites work.
Yeah, we don't like this word, and we really want to advocate for a different word. The problem is that in our 15 minutes of going to thesaurus.com looking for another word, we haven't found one that's better.
Well,
there's one
that's great.
There's a really great word.
There's one that describes it perfectly.
Fantastic word.
It's like a group that only wants to be with each other and no one else.
Right. Like a family.
Like a family that only wants to be with each other.
Yeah.
Ever.
Right.
And make more of that family together.
Right. But not with other people.
Not with other families.
There's probably a word for that.
Probably.
However, I feel like parasitic isn't the correct term for Honkai Star Rail, and rather a much better name for this specific situation is archetypal design, where units are jammed into these archetypes and rarely ever want to interact with other units outside of theirs. Now, dear viewer, I know what you're thinking. How is archetypal design even a problem? So, let's go through the pros and cons first. Archetypal design pros. First is that the meta is solved fast. If the devs themselves create characters to fit in specific, pre-packaged archetypes, it means that, with a couple glances at the character's kit, you'll be able to spot keywords and immediately tell who works with what. Second is that the meta is relatively controlled. Outliers are much less likely to happen if devs intentionally slam units into specific teams. And of course, the greatest incentive of all, money. Creating units that really want each other means that the players will have to pull new teams and new pieces every year. This means more money for Hoyoverse. You can say that this is a con disguised as a pro, in which, you'd be correct. You can easily see these coalesce in the Mono Remembrance flagship. At a glance, you can tell that these HP scalers are good with one another, with some side grade options on the side. If you've noticed, these pros all benefit the devs as they no longer have to be as meticulous when tuning characters, because they can just restrict units to want specific pieces so that they don't have to think about Robin, Action Forwarding, Caceres, Pollux, Hyacine, Little Ika, Evernight, Jellyfish all at the same time. Eevee, actually not Jellyfish, that's not her name. Either way, they chose to make them scale with HP and gimp Robin's value in those teams. So, let's move on to the archetypal design cons. First up is that it severely limits team building options. One that immediately comes to mind is Ceridra, and how much she's been shafted beyond the 3, maybe 4 units she works with. As mentioned, the Remembrance flagship only really have Tribi and Remembrance MC as side grades, and the path itself has very little give in terms of 4-star options too, outside of Battle Pass light cones. Next is if your entire archetype is performing poorly, the entire roster needs a Nova Flare. We have seen this with the entirety of the Dot archetype, as both Kafka and Black Swan genuinely never shined ever since their release, aside from when they were being shilled for pure fiction. The problem with that though is that whenever Dot was shilled, the content itself was much harder for other archetypes because Dot stage buffs have to be so good to carry the washed up teams, and units that can't make use of them are cooked. Now, on the bright side, Dot is actually functional right now, and it looks like devs are actually ramping up the frequency in the amount of Nova Flares they hand out. But hoping for Nova Flares instead of having units be balanced on release is a little cooked in my opinion. And finally, if you're an older archetype, receiving support from future characters is unlikely. Black Swan released in 2.0 and High Sealants released in 3.5. More than a year has passed while Dot was drowning in the waves of HP inflation, since then without a Nova Flare. It is utterly brutal how long they've neglected this archetype. Currently, Feixiao's received a similar treatment, as there currently has been no relevant units for Fart until Ashveil's release. You can argue that Cypher exists, but her one follow-up attack per turn kinda gamps Feixiao's stack generation, especially when you have free units like Moza running around. Conclusion. Now, if you were paying close attention to my points, you would realize that most of these issues are fixed for you if your teams get Nova Flared or get a support in future patches. And herein lies the issue. The problem that archetypal design brings is that there's no assurance that your archetype will be saved by the devs unless you are a flagship character or if your name is Firefly. I'll point out a couple characters to illustrate my point. If you like these nerdy analytical videos, please hit that like button and subscribe so that you'll be informed whenever I release more of it. Thank you. Dr. Ratio and Acheron have been dead in the waters, pun intended, for quite a long time due to Acheron's power in 2.6, stifling the design space for Nihility as mentioned in a previous video. Dr. Ratio's teams require at least 3 debuffs, which locks at least one team slot to either be a Nihility or Topaz, which restricts his ability to use the newfangled generalist supports from the latest patch. So the case is the same for Acheron. The only real support they've obtained through the year is Cypher, which simply isn't enough to revive either of them without investment. Even with heavy investment, both Acheron and Ratio's Eidolons aren't that good anyway. I wrote the script in January, and college has been beating my ass. Mortenax Blade now finally gives Acheron a much needed revival, but it's a little insane you had to wait for an entire year of drowning in HP bloat to get it. Did you notice that Cypher supports both Feixiao and Acheron, yet isn't enough to revive either of them? Rough times we live in if you aren't super shielded by the devs. Rappa and Boothill were monsters for 2.x, then somewhat shafted in 3.x due to the toughness inflation that occurred. Now, they are also tied to the hip to their super break supports, meaning you don't have the option to slot in new generalist supports either, unless those generalists have insane amounts of amplification to compensate. On top of this, they can't make use of the newly released super break support, Dahlia, as well as Firefly does. This really showcases the favoritism at play here. I'd even go as far as saying Firefly might even get Nova Flared on top of this because she's Xiaoji's girlfriend. Oh god, this really was like so long ago. I wrote the script so long ago. She did get Nova Flared. Wow. Now, while the Herta is currently strong in pure fiction, I believe that her design has screwed her over. I personally have her at E2 and I'm using her with an E1 Tribi and Serval, and she's struggling to clear knights where she should be dominating in Anomaly Arbitration. I understand that AA is a whalebait game mode and has no rewards, but it revealed to me the fact that the Herta forcing you to slot in an erudition essentially wastes that slot, as that unit currently will not provide personal damage, buffs or debuffs, and is just there to generate stacks, which other units from other paths can do in their stead. There currently is no dedicated erudition support that really works well with the Herta in Anomaly Arbitration, and she suffers for it. I already know that people are going to point out Anaxa and Jade, but Anaxa himself actually performs better alone as a hyper carry because he isn't forced to waste a team slot and he can use Cyrene Ceridra. Jade is fine, but if you look at the buffers of today that can generate stacks for the Herta like RMC and Tribi, I'm sure they'd be way better for her if the archetypal erudition tag was removed. I'm most likely going to have a dedicated Herta video soon. Archetypal design leads to situations where you are forced to pull 2 different units who synergize heavily with one another and not many other units. And once their archetype gets washed in the waves of power creep, you can't even slot in a new support unless they're tailor-made for them, or if they're so game-breaking that it just blows other options out of the water. So you might ask, what's the solution? There's multiple solutions to this, and it seems like Koyoverse is already catching on. First is obviously just Nova Flare certain characters and team compositions if they fall way too far behind. I'm honestly impressed that HSR even bothered to do this, since it used to be super rare for Hoyo to buff literally anything back in the early Genshin days. There's no profit incentive for them, so I have to give them credit where it's due. Second is to release units that help older units out, and this is typically harder to do since you actually have to make a whole new character with lore, marketing, and fitting them into the story. I think so far, it's literally just High Sealants that fits this description. Oh, Dahlia too, of course. And finally, to make units at least be able to use the generalist buffers without insane damage losses. And with how I've written the script, it seems like the future ahead is hopeful, since Hoyoverse is actively doing things to give power to older characters. But Elation itself looks to be extremely archetypal as well. Elation in itself is pretty much just a different damage formula, and what you need to know is that it's only affected by the new keywords the Elation path brings. It only scales off crit and the debuffs that are on the enemy. This means that the harmonies that buff attack percent and damage percent won't be that useful alongside Elation, and that while nihilities like Silverwolf, Cypher, and Tribi might work in the meantime, I think it's pretty obvious that the best possible team you can build in the future is going to be Mono Elation with all of the merry-making punchlines, certified banger keyword stacking. But the moment we move on from plain Arcadia, the support for the archetype is going to dwindle fast, just like how there has only been, at most, one Remembrance character planned in the future currently. Sure, Sparxie Eidolons and Mono Remembrance look absolutely insane right now, but the point still stands that you are meant to pull all these units together, then put them on the shelf after a year or two. But there's a final point about archetypal design that I haven't told you yet. The good thing about archetypal design is that the devs can keep releasing units that do different things and deal damage with different formulas without affecting the balance of existing units. Theoretically, if they keep the ceiling of Mono Remembrance and Mono Elation around the same level, they can just keep releasing and buffing units around the same power level and effectively negate power creep. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think this will ever happen? Me personally, I'd say hell no. If my old Bell team could clear Anomaly Arbitration as well as my current E6 Archer team does, I would just be stocking up my Jades forever until I want to E6 another character I really like. And if a Dolphin or a Whale meta chaser had the same line of thinking I did, then that means Hoyoverse would lose money. But I look back to the Noble Flares. I see the characters that I pulled solely because I like their designs and personality. I look at how much they've gotten buffed and how meta relevant they are now. And I think to myself, why? Why did they do this with no profit incentive? Maybe the real Honkai Star Rail was the waifus we got along the way. That's it from me. My name is Kyte, and thank you for watching. See ya. Peace.